From the nation's capital, the American Enterprise Institute for Public Policy Research presents Public Policy Forums, a series of programs featuring the nation's top authorities presenting their differing views on the vital issues which confront us. Today's topic, professors, politicians, and public policy.
Most American presidents going far back into the last century have sought advice and counsel from the nation's colleges and universities. Many presidents have appointed prominent professors to high government positions. Many members of the academic community have served in either the House or the Senate. In more recent days, presidents have called on advisory groups of college and university experts to lend their expertise in trying to solve the nation's problems. College professors frequently testify before congressional committees on the pros or cons of proposed legislation. Over the years, what has been the impact of universities on public policy? And what exactly is the proper role academia should play in government, if any? In short, what is or what should be the relationship between campus and government? In recent years, universities have become, in many cases, the center of adversary culture. What is the importance of academia as an attitude-generating body? How do ideological undercurrents at universities affect our society? Welcome to another Public Policy Forum presented by AEI, the American Enterprise Institute, a nonprofit, nonpartisan research and education organization. Our experts will be discussing the topic, professors, politicians, and public policy. Appearing on our panel are S.I. Hayakawa, Republican Senator from California. Senator Hayakawa is familiar with both academia and politics, having taught at 4 colleges and most recently having served as president of San Francisco State University. Senator Hayakawa is known worldwide for his writings on linguistics and semantics. Daniel Patrick Moynihan, Democratic Senator from New York. Senator Moynihan is also at home in both worlds, having been a Harvard professor for many years and having served in a cabinet or sub-cabinet position with Presidents Kennedy, Johnson, Nixon, and Ford. He has been a U.S. ambassador to the United Nations and ambassador to India. Robert Bork is Chancellor Kent Professor of Law and Legal History at Yale University and a recent resident scholar at the American Enterprise Institute. He was Solicitor General of the United States from 1973 to 1977. Mr. Bork is the author of a detailed study of the political activities of colleges and universities. Irving Kristol is a senior fellow of the American Enterprise Institute and Henry R. Luce Professor of Urban Values at New York University. He is co-editor with Nathan Glazer of the Public Interest magazine. Long prominent in the world of ideas, he has been an editor of Encounter and Commentary magazines and is a member of the Board of Contributors of the Wall Street Journal. Moderating the discussion is John Charles Daly, former news correspondent and analyst at both CBS and ABC. He is former director of the Voice of America. Now, here is Mr. Daly.
This Public Policy Forum, part of a series presented by the American Enterprise Institute, is concerned with the basic relationship between academia and government. The discussion alliteratively entitled Professors, Politicians, and Public Policy. Our panel is a splendid mix, professors all, with 2 now serving as United States Senators, another former Solicitor General of the United States, and the 4th an editor who has described himself as a journalist, at best a man of letters. Well, to establish a broad base for the dialogue, gentlemen, will you in turn address briefly the question, how deeply has academia affected government policy? First, Senator Moynihan.
I think we say, and Sam and I agreed ahead of time, he's the authority, that we say academia.
I knew I was going to have that trouble.
And you can remember that by thinking of academia nuts. A brief proposition, the It may not be that we're the best people to ask. I think of that occasion when Oscar Wilde was taken to view Niagara Falls. He stared a moment and turned and said, "You know, it would be more impressive if it flowed the other way." and I think maybe the audience would be a better judgment. Academia has influenced policy in the whole experience of government in the West, from the time of the Church Fathers to Adam Smith was a professor. I think what we've seen in our time is the way academia has affected the personnel of politics. I was a member of the cabinet of President Ford, a solid, sensible, serious man, and yet the only time I ever doubted him, I think, was I was sitting we had a cabinet meeting one morning, and I looked around, and what did I see in that rather small table of 14 chairs but 6 professors? The Secretary of State was a professor, the Secretary of Defense was a professor, the Attorney General was a professor, the Secretary of Labor was a professor, the Secretary of Agriculture was a professor, and the U.S. Permanent Representative at the United Nations. This is new, and I think it affects the way people think about politics, and it's the big change from the long hegemony of lawyers in American political life.
All right. Professor Kristol.
Back in the 19th century, in the frontier towns of the West, a professor used to be defined as the man who played the piano in the bordello. And if you watch old Western movies and the Late Late Show, you'll still see a cowboy coming into the bar and telling the piano player to play something and address him as professor. This seemed to suggest that at that time, Americans did not have a particularly high opinion of professors when it came to doing serious things, though they obviously had skills, say at the piano, that the average American did not have. I think that has changed radically in the past century or century and a half. Today, professors are, together with their satellite group, the media, the only sector of our society which claims the right to define the public interest. Every other sector in the society is now defined as a special interest. Professors are the ones who know what the public interest is and have gained credibility in terms of their power to define it.
Senator Hayakawa.
It often seems to me, to take the matter outside our own country, that one of the problems of communism is that it is a dictatorship of intellectuals, and mostly professors. That is, insofar as a nation is governed by ruling ideology, whether Marxism or any other ism, it is essentially a dictatorship of people who have read the sacred books, know the answers to all problems of public interest, and therefore are able to define what is good for everybody far better than, let us say, the hardware man, the blacksmith, the accountant, or the realtor. Professors really know their way around in the world of ideas, in the world of moral values. Now, in this country, we have not gone as far by any means as the communist nations in elevating the ideologue, the ideologist, the theoretician to a lofty place in society. But when Pat described President Ford's cabinet, I thought we were getting there pretty fast.
Professor Ball.
Well, I think it's arguable, indeed I will argue, that professors are probably the single most influential class in terms of public policy in the United States. And that's not only because they man administrations. I know that Pat Moynihan has manned the last half dozen administrations in this country. But it's because they're verbalists. They are skilled in ideas and they're quite articulate. And that happens to be a very intimidating and very influential style in the society. And I think it's demonstrable, maybe we'll get into it later, that our foreign policy would be quite different were it not for the influence of the professoriate. The outcome, I suppose, of the Vietnam War is probably heavily influenced by the attitude of the campuses. And in domestic policy, I think we have been moving in directions that the professoriate has wanted us to move for a long time, and most scholarly work and speaking pushes us in that direction.
All right, Messrs. Ladd and Lipset, authors of The Divided Academy, quote President John Adams as saying in 1798, "I really begin to think, or rather to suspect, that learned academies, not under the immediate inspection and control of government, have disorganized the world and are incompatible with social order." Well, now that we're 200 years old as a nation, does our history show that to be true?
If I could say, there's a transition in what John Adams was saying, because he was speaking of the universities of clerics. And the role of the cleric from the Middle Ages in the Christian and Hebraic tradition was an academic, intellectual one. And Sam, that's a problem for you. In what way was the 17th century different from the 20th century in terms of the influence of people whose main interest was ideology and whose normal locus was in the university, Cambridge University in the 17th century?
Well, it seems to me that we've often had government by soldiers as a ruling class. And certainly we had a very, very different quality of government in those times. And then, of course, landowners have governed in other times in world history. And sometimes there are combinations of landowners and soldiers and farmers. But what Professor Bork says about the culture being predominantly verbal, and one in which the verbalist has perhaps more than his due share of influence, as opposed to the, say, seafarer or the aviator or the engineer or the physician, people who do things with something other than words, in addition to words. I'm not sure that this is an entirely good thing for a culture. As a semanticist, which means that I've spent pretty much my professional career on the study of words and their influence on human affairs, I really have come to distrust those whose lives are exclusively preoccupied with them.
I think the big difference between the academy today and what we might call the clerisy of yesterday is the convergence that has taken place over the last century between the world of thought and the world of action. The clerisy of yesterday, the professor of 100 years ago, was assumed to be a scholar and a teacher who lived pretty much in an ivory tower. And in fact, he was supposed to live in an ivory tower. It was assumed that he had great knowledge of certain things, but that this knowledge was not necessarily a good guide to practical action, so that no one turned to them, or rarely were they turned to, for guidance on matters of public policy. They were moralists, they were philosophers. They were influential in general terms, as Adam Smith was, but it really wasn't until quite late in the 19th century that they begin to be taken seriously as, quote, experts, unquote. Now, in our day, of course, professors are taken very seriously as having matters of practical import on public policy. Every professor in the United States is convinced that his opinions ought to be sought out on matters of public policy, that they are relevant to matters of public policy. You tell a professor these days he lives in an ivory tower and he becomes very indignant and will explain to you that he doesn't live in an ivory tower at all. If you suggest to him that he ought to live in an ivory tower, he thinks you're mad. They have come out of the ivory tower. And what we have now in this country are some 600,000 professors who, some of whom are genuinely interested in teaching and scholarship, a considerable number of whom who happen to be teachers and scholars or happen to hold university positions, but whose major interest is in worldly affairs. And they want to help run the world.
You know, if you're going to discuss the question of how has the academic world changed and why has its influence changed, I suppose the single largest factor would be simply the explosion in size of the academic world. There was a time when the professor was, and the university was small enough so that it didn't feel itself to be a class with special interests of its own and influence of its own. Now, the number of professors, the number of students, the size of universities has increased so much that we have a critical mass, which feels itself to be a distinct group with distinct interests of its own, attitudes of its own, which it now offers to the society and indeed presses upon the society with a suggestion that the society which does not accept their ideas is morally deficient.
I think Bob Bork has said something important about the presumption of academics and professors that they know something other people ought to accept. And it's a kind of a play on word, professor, profession. There is a very different, there's a problem in democracy when a large number of persons who would define themselves as professionals are in positions of leadership, because we have not paid much attention to the professions and their development. There's a move to professionalize everything. I mean, undertakers want to be a profession and things like that. But the real professions are able to look somebody in the eye and say, you think you know, but you don't know. I know. And that's and it says here on the wall, I know, you don't know. That's not a relationship of a democratic politician to a democratic citizen. It's different, isn't it?
Well, now, Professor Kristol, I think you defined an intellectual as a man who speaks with general authority about a subject on which he has no particular competence. Does that fit in with what...
Well...
No, wait just a second. It's not solved. And if the competence of the professions is very real, but in any event, the important thing is that the society has accepted that the idea of their competence. The society accepts the idea that only a dentist can tell a dentist, and who should be a dentist.
Pat, I think you're missing something, though, which is that a professional with a degree on the wall, which says he is qualified to talk to you about law, because he's a professor, will talk to you about everything else but law and expect you to listen to him anyway. And we get linguists who know all about the war in Vietnam, and we get the one I was referring to isn't here this evening.
No, he's not.
And we get economists who know all about moral values. And they're listened to because they're professors,
Bob,
even though it is not their...
We used to have, the primal profession in our society was the clerisy, the church. It gave way to the lawyer, and the lawyer spoke on a wide range of subjects.
But that's surely justified.
No. No. I think you've touched on an important point, Pat. The lawyer was not given credibility as an expert in these matters because he had studied law books, but because it was assumed that the practice of law had brought him a great deal of worldly wisdom. He knew a great deal about the affairs of men, and above all, he knew how to adjudicate quarrels, which is what the essence of politics is, after all.
More than that, there was a time when the knowledge professions that have proliferated recently did not exist, and the only profession of verbalists were the lawyers.
Yes. But you know, we're getting here, touching here on something terribly important, which is I want to return to it, the convergence of the realms of thought and the realms of action. In the United States today, any professor of international relations, let us say, well, that's not fair, most professors of international relations genuinely believe that they know how to run American foreign policy. And most professors of economics believe that they know how to run the economy and would very much like to have the chance to do it, to show that they can do it. The university of yesteryear did not have such people, for the most part. For the most part, it had people who thought they were educating. Now, they might want to educate public opinion in certain ways, but they did not have the feeling that somehow they were peculiarly suited to run things. There is a terribly important point here, namely that when you're in the hands of professionals, who in fact don't know what to do, but nevertheless have the only professional authority to do it. I think it was George Bernard Shaw who said that prior to, that the history, it was only after 1905 that doctors started to do more good to their patients than harm. In other words, it is possible
No, that's
wasn't
not
George
so.
Bernard Shaw?
Irving, that is very careful research about, and it's a dispute in medicine. At what point in time did the random patient meeting the random doctor with the random disease turn out to be better off than otherwise? And some say 1910, others say 1921. They learned a lot from their mistakes, though. They did it. But what Shaw said in the Revolutionist Handbook and Pocket Companion, in Maxims for Revolutionists, he said, those who can do, those who cannot teach. And that's your problem. You don't like that. You agree with Shaw.
Now, there is nevertheless, doctors were a profession prior to 1905. And the fact that they may have done you more harm than good on a randomized basis did not stop them from being doctors with a certain claim to expertise. Now, if you're talking about economists, I have a dreadful feeling that we may be at 1903 or 1893. That is, they are the only experts we have, but I am not at all sure that they are doing more good than harm. They have a lot of theories, and they're sure their theories are worthwhile and are important, and I'm not so sure the world has improved all that much since we began governed by people's economic theories rather than by men of experience using some common sense.
Come on, Irving, that's not so. Would you like to work at the average hourly wages in the garment industry of 1903? No. Now look, there are two things here.
What's that got to do with economic theory?
That we're talking about the advance of knowledge which has shaped our whole lives, and the fundamental phenomenon is technology, and the greatest thrust of that technology has come out of academia, and some measure of managing it has also come with it. And let's be, I think, clear that there are nuts among the professoriate, but much the greater number are people who have, just because they are a profession, are in fact have the security of tenure, as it were to say. As a matter of fact, we don't know anything about that. And you know the people, and Bob and Sam, I mean, most of your best colleagues, when you ask them really difficult questions, say, I don't know. And who began stating that the things in economics were not known? Herb Stein, when he was chairman of the council. He's an impeccable academic, says he don't know. A couple of years later, Arthur Burns, now chairman of the Federal Reserve Board, went before committees of Congress and put it in a nice sort of indirect way. He says, things aren't working the way they used to work. Which is
the question is whether they used to work the way they used to work, but never mind. No, look, I mean, I understand, Pat. We're not talking about our friends. I mean, they're the good academics, right? They don't go around saying they know things when, in fact, they know they don't know. In fact, some of us are making a profession out of explaining how much we and others don't know. That's known as critical sociology or critical.
I'm not sure we've gotten down to the specific. Would you try to draw your picture?
No, I was thinking that we're leading up, in a way, through this discussion of the economists, a majority of the good ones say they don't know, and of course how many good ones they are at that point becomes relevant. But I think we may be leading up to the question of whether the professoriate has characteristic viewpoints, whether there is a general outlook of intellectuals and I'm not going to try that word, academicians as a class.
I wish I hadn't.
Which leads public policy in particular directions. And that's wider than economics, and it's wider than law. And I suppose the book by Ladd and Lipset, to which Mr. Daly referred, shows what we all know from common observation, that in fact professors, particularly at the most prestigious universities, tend rather strongly to be left liberal and to have preferences for more government regulation in economics as in social matters. And I think in foreign policy matters tend to be less aggressive or less likely to defend aggressive American actions overseas. And that may be more important than the assumption of verbalists to have expertise they may not have. The fact that the pressure, the outlook, the verbalization is primarily in one direction.
The one conclusion, I think, in the divided academy that was, in a sense, against that particular train of thought. They, I think, made a conclusion that discipline, the specific field of intellectual activity, differentiates faculty political orientations to such a high degree as to make questionable the wisdom of references. They noticed the difference between social studies and engineering, for instance.
I mean, there's a hierarchy. You can scale people. I mean, if you want a real conservative, find a geologist. If you want a next most real conservative, find an agronomist. If you're looking for the other end, find a sociologist. And we know that about each other. We're good at this.
No, well, you know that, but the interesting thing is
it seems to me that this deals with a fundamental distinction among human beings that I love to play with. There are the people whose lives, the whole meaning of their lives revolves around the handling of symbols, words. And they are the intellectuals, they're the preachers, they're the lawyers, they're the media people, they're the people who speculate in grain futures without ever harvesting a bushel of grain. But they are verbalists. Then there are the people who, I shall say, these are the symbol handlers. Now there's the other people who are, shall I say, the thing handlers. That is, they can be engineers because whatever words or diagrams they produce ultimately has to validate itself in a bridge that stands up, in a building that sustains its own weight, and so on. So I would say that although both classes use words and symbols, there's one class whose words are ultimately validated in a nonverbal event, as in the case of a farmer or an agronomist or an engineer or a geologist. See? And then there are those, like philosophers, sociologists, English majors like me, and lawyers like you, whose words do not come under the discipline of that load in the truck that shifts without your knowing it, and so your truck turns over. Your words are not subject to the discipline of the great steamship that wanders off course because of factors you didn't talk about in your lecture on navigation. Now this is the great division, and if there's something wrong with our culture and our whole general direction, is not just academia, it's the whole class of symbol manipulators who rule the world. Now William Rusher was sort of groping for this when he said that the world is divided into producers and non-producers. Of course, he's, as a verbalist himself, he had to classify himself as a non-producer. but he classified among the non-producers the intellectuals and the media people. And if there is any amelioration of the condition under which so many of us suffer from the barrage of windbags all over the place, and I refer to ourselves as well as the media people, the people who handle the symbols, it seems to me we all require this discipline in rooting our ultimate experience in the nonverbal world. And so this is why I've always felt that all of us in the verbal professions, ought to take up something nonverbal.
Sam, how could you say that? The only things that matter are symbols. Everybody knows that.
I know.
What does the Bible say? In the beginning was the Word.
I want to elaborate on what Sam Hayakawa was saying, because I think he's put his finger on it exactly. If you were to ask, what is that one thing that professors and intellectuals, and by the way, it's interesting that we seem to be using the two terms interchangeably. As Bob Nisbet once pointed out, 75 years ago, if you wanted to criticize a professor, you called him an intellectual. And if you wanted to criticize an intellectual, you called him academic. They were two different worlds. The intellectuals were not in universities. They were out in Greenwich Village or somewhere. They weren't supposed to be in universities. But there has been a merger in that academicians have taken over the attitude of intellectuals, and of course intellectuals are now located on campuses. But the one thing I think that is true of both professors and intellectuals in the world today is that they are rationalists. They believe that, put it this way, that if you know the right theory, you can bake the right cake. And that practical experience in baking cakes is not all that important. They think if you have the right theory of politics, practical wisdom about the governance of men and women is not so important. This is what Michael Oakeshott calls the rationalist fallacy, that if you know the theory of it, you also know the practice of it. But the world of fact, the world of reality, is a very recalcitrant world, recalcitrant to theory. And, you know, it reminds me of that famous story of the Israeli young man who tried to volunteer for the Navy. And he was interviewed, and they asked him, "Can you swim?" And he said, "No, but I know the theory of it." There is a difference. And many of the important things in this world cannot be learned systematically. They can only be learned by practical experience, by having a sense, as a cook has a sense, of just how much to put in, how much not to put in. It's government is a practical art, not a theoretical art. And one of the problems we suffer from at the moment is the infusion into government of political science, political theory, and sociology, and the extrusion of practical wisdom.
That's right.
Government is altogether a theoretical art. It deals fundamentally with symbols, and it's the only thing people really care about. It's the only thing they'll die for. It's the thing they most live for, and that troubles you. And I don't blame you for being troubled, but it is the truth, Irving.
Yeah, but when they try to... it's very beautiful what you say, Pat, you know, that you have a theory of housing for the poor. And we have lots and lots of wonderful theoreticians who have lots of theories about housing for the poor. And that's why we still have a housing problem for the poor.
Well, look, I agree with you, Pat, that no, the symbols of authority are in some ultimate sense of ultimate importance. But that's not, the symbols of authority are not the same thing as governance. That is, acceptance of the symbols of authority permits you to govern. But then, once you have that permission, you have the job to do.
That's right.
I do think that one of the things that has happened in all of it's not just in the United States, it's happened in Western Europe, it's happened in Africa, it's happened in Asia, is the infusion into the world of practice of various theories and the depreciation of practical wisdom, of traditional wisdom. You know, it's no longer good enough to say, the reason we should do it this way is we've always done it this way and it seems to work. That's no longer acceptable as a reason for doing something, and yet it probably is the best reason for doing something in the world.
No, but I think Pat's point may be that, unfortunately, reality can only be perceived often through theory and symbols, and you have to try to perceive that reality as in economics. And somebody, the practical cook, may produce disasters. And the question is, who's the best theorist? Now, the difficulty is that in the symbol world, in the verbalist world, there is no external discipline. The senator points to that the building doesn't fall down. Or if it does fall down, you can explain that it's due to some other factor. Or that it's due to the fact that you didn't take my theory far enough. But there's no escape from using theorists and verbalists in these matters.
Right. Now, theorists and verbalists do have a function. I don't mean to ridicule them. They have a very important role to play in shaping our general way of looking at the world. But that's different from actually intervening and shaping public policy on particular issues or in particular spheres. Obviously, if you're an educator, you educate people to view the world in a certain way. And professors and intellectuals have that function. Whether they execute it well or not is another matter, but that no one can take away that particular function from them. They teach our children, and they teach our children how to look at the world. And that's their job, and I think they should be doing it better than they are doing. On the other hand, that is not the same thing as the governance of men or the governance of affairs.
We're talking about a class of people which we seem to agree is quite important and which we seem to agree has problems because it's not subject to external discipline as it should be. But I wonder if it isn't true, or maybe it isn't, that it forms a class of people who have distinctive public policy biases and therefore tend to move our public policy in a particular direction.
I believe this does tend to move public policy in certain directions. It moves people in the direction of often being enchanted, over-enchanted with, let's say, a body of theory, so that they go in the direction of what Karl Popper calls utopianism. So you draw a mental picture of a beautiful, beautiful world that you'd like to move reality to. And it seems to me that insofar as we have utopian elements in our social planning, and social planning itself involves a certain kind of utopianism, even a limited one, insofar as we do this, we try to impose a map on the territory and try to make the territory conform to the map rather than the other way about. Gosh, I'm talking like a general semanticist.
Well, now, look, I'll tell you what you're talking like. You're talking like a professor with one of a range of views professors have about how to run government properly, which is don't do too much. Who do you cite, Sam? You cite Karl Popper, who I studied with him in the London School of Economics. You know that wonderful, the English have a verb which is conjugated, I am Oxford. You are Cambridge. He is the London School of Economics. I studied with Popper. But may I say that, you know, in the end, the important things really are big questions. You're going to end up asking professors about them.
I think Sam Hayakawa has uttered a key word, utopianism, because one of the phenomena, and I would not say that it's inevitable, but it certainly has been a historical product of the explosion that Bob Bork referred to of the modern academy, has been a strong element of utopianism in our society. And we had a wonderful instance of this when the President of the United States said on television that life is unfair. Now, I don't know any taxi driver in the United States who would disagree with him. Nevertheless, an awful lot of college graduates got very upset because he said that life is unfair, because they have it figured out that life is not supposed to be unfair. And by God, if given the chance, they'll see to it that it's not unfair.
Professor Bork, you raised this issue, as Professor Kristol has just noted, this spread of education. And I think a basic question lies therein. Turning the coin around, has the spread of education, particularly university education, decreased or increased the acceptance of our society's institutions?
I think it's arguable, and in fact I think it's true, that it probably has decreased the authority, the moral authority of the institutions of the society. The intellectual class generally tends to be highly critical of traditional institutions and tends to, as somebody said, actively unfit the students for their future environment. In fact, some of them think that is their function, to make them dissatisfied with their future environment. As somebody else, as Trilling said, it's not only an adversary intention, it's also a subversive intention. Mm-hmm. And I think you can observe a flattening of the American institutional landscape, in part because of the attitudes inculcated in the university and carried on to the university's allies, which are the media and the clergy to some extent. And in that sense, I think the influence has been quite harmful to traditional institutions and values.
May I ask whether that Lionel Trilling wrote his article, his essay on the adversary culture in 1947? About that.
About that, yes.
All right. Now, are we in a cycle or are we in a fixed condition, a stasis? I mean, if you think of the academic who's had the most political influence in our age in this century, surely it was Woodrow Wilson. Professor Wilson became president. And surely, in the most extraordinary way, he confirmed the very basic American ideas of the time. He was scarcely hostile to what was established. His intention was not subversive, much less adversary. Need we continue in the phase from the 1930s on? Academe was very much a supportive of institutions until the Great Depression, and a movement of ethnic groups outside into them. May they not now cycle into a celebratory, or at least use the word establishment? I mean, what is the brightest think tank in Washington? The American Enterprise Institute. Radical? It is not. Subversive? Certainly. No.
Yeah, but I think this has to be said as an addendum to Bob Bork's point, which is essentially correct, that it is one of the functions of education and of intellectuals to alienate students from their society. I mean, that's what education means. You gain, or are supposed to gain, a certain detachment from your society. But it is supposed to be an intellectual detachment.
Now, Irving, that's not so. Schumpeter laid it down, right? What did Schumpeter say of capitalism, that which you most admire? And he said, what is the whole process of capitalism? It is a process of creative destruction. And it destroys the usefulness of last year's automobile as well as last year's idea. This particular role of the academia, which I think some of you tend to dissociate from the larger culture and see it in adversary mode, I think Schumpeter would say never was there a more capitalist institution than the anti-establishmentarian, anti-establishment university. It is the essence of the capitalist mode. If you don't like that, try feudalism, try socialism. Don't try enterprise. Don't try enterprise, because enterprise keeps saying otherwise.
No, but I'm sorry, go ahead.
That's a good point.
I just want to catch Pat on this, but Woodrow Wilson had many of the characteristics of the intellectual, and the worst one of all that he had was exactly this utopianism we're talking about. And he drove the world towards an unrealizable dream, and was terribly, terribly disillusioned when he found it was unrealizable, and is a sort of characteristic tragic story of ideology.
Of professors or Presbyterians, which? I'm really sorry, which?
Yes, all right. No, perhaps both.
Professor Bork?
Well, Irving said, and I guess some others have said, that it is the characteristic function of the professor or the intellectual, which is a wider class, to question the status quo and to produce alienation, intellectual alienation in the students. If that were true, if that were the only explanation of the attitudes we see in professors, then I would expect to see, for example, the universities severely questioning the welfare state, severely questioning the regulatory state, and undercutting what is today's status quo. I don't think that's the case.
Do that, no.
They are not opposed to the status quo. They are opposed to particular institutions.
Now, I was saying there is some propriety in saying that a good education has an alienating consequence of a kind. I want to defend the notion that education should liberate the young person to understand the limitations of his society, as compared with previous societies. And he can go home and read the Greek authors and understand that they were greater than any playwright we have had in our century. But that was intellectual liberation, a private liberation for your private consumption. It was not assumed in Harvard in the 1880s that this liberation would then send you out into society to overturn it. On the contrary,
Irving,
the assumption
that was what they did in the bad decade. At Harvard in the 1880s, all they thought was going out and Christianize America at last. There was great revival at the time.
I don't regard that as changing society.
And I want to speak up for academia, because I'll never get back, and I long for it. I miss it. they do preserve. They preserve Aeschylus, and they preserve Plato, and they preserve Trilling. And tell me one damn thing General Motors has ever preserved. I mean, every year there's a new world begun, and everything past is over, it has to be changed, got rid of.
You want General Motors to preserve the car model of 1910? What is it
I thought 1925 was a good year.
Your argument might lead to the conclusion that General Motors has moved on from 1925, but the academic world hasn't.
Capitalism is destructive.
They're still producing that old bad model up there in Cambridge.
I went to City College, and Irving, Kristol did too, and we don't have to apologize for that. But I'm telling you, you are in the vortex of the destruction of values. To wit, whatever you had last year, you must be dissatisfied with and get nothing new.
I think that's a very valid point. I mean, capitalism is destructive of values. And it is no accident that the kind of criticism that professors, for instance, make of their society and the kind of recommendations they make for public policy never end up with a suggestion that a policy be instituted which results in less power or prestige or authority for professors. I mentioned at the beginning the question of the public interest. The way, and here I'm sure the two senators know more about it than I do, the way our conflict of interest laws are now being defined, it becomes almost impossible for a businessman to take a job in government, almost impossible for a trade unionist to take a job in government. The one group who can take jobs in government are professors. They can take a job in government, they come right back to the university, there are no conflict of interest. Now, is it an accident that this is the way the conflict of interest laws are being promulgated?
May I offer an illustration? I wonder if Sam would agree with me. We just went through a draconian institution of restraints on how much money any senator could earn outside from consulting, from lawyering, from doctoring, and so on. One exception. What was the exception, Sam?
Books, yes, books.
Yes, there's
right.
no exception.
Book royalties.
Book royalties are accepted.
Right.
You know, Robert Hutchins at the University of Chicago once tried to institute that at the university. He said, we are an academic community, therefore there should be no conflict of interest. All royalties earned from your textbooks or from your outside lecturers or your outside consultantships will go to the university and will pay professors much better than they have been hitherto. But all professors will be paid alike, regardless of how popular their textbooks are. And the faculty of the University of Chicago was not about to have that.
Well, they had a good point. You know, you do get more scholarship if you allow some return from it, unfortunately.
The capitalist ethos,
Yes, it's capitalist ethos.
Let's
No, but
touch.
I don't understand what you say what you mean when you say capitalism destroys values. Could you elaborate on that, anyone?
No.
I mean, you talked about destroying old automobiles, but what values are destroyed particularly?
This is Schumpeter's analysis that the capitalist spirit appears in the world, and it appears characteristically not least in universities, as a rejection of the established and presumably immutable systems of the Middle Ages. It says no, change, question, argue, and it proceeds to delegitimate the authority of church and Lord and such things like that, and creates its own, by a process of delegitimating, it created itself. But, says Schumpeter, it can't stop there. It will then go on to delegitimate itself. And that the vanguard of this will always be the intellectuals. And, says he, the capitalists will support them, provide for them, pay for them, nurture them, because
the Ford Foundation.
he sees in them the essence of his own being. And it's sort of sad that he knows he's doing it to himself, but he will go on till it's all over, and when it's all over, they'll be quiet again, and God have mercy.
Well, thank you, Pat. You make me awfully glad I've never read Schumpeter.
No, but I think one thing ought to be said about that, and that is I think you're quite right, and Schumpeter's quite right, that the capitalist spirit does, being intensely rational, tending to quantify things, tending to doubt things, does destroy traditional values. The difficulty is, I think, that people don't do awfully well without some transcendental values to believe in. And the one they tend to turn to now is the secularization of spiritual values, which turns out to mean the equality of man, turns out to mean socialism and social reform, which is probably what will undo. The desire for those transcendental values coming out in that way is probably what will undo capitalism.
I think it's time to open the question and answer session. May I have the first question, please?
Peter McPherson, I'm a tax lawyer here in town. My question is particularly timely because Professor Bork has several times raised the question of bias in the academic community. And since I gather everyone agrees that they are a very important community, it seems to me that the panel might want to spend some time trying to figure out why that bias is there and if the current bias is a long-term one.
I don't like the term bias. It's the wrong word. What we're talking about here is an intellectual tradition going back well over 2 centuries, perhaps 3 centuries, an attitude toward the world, which is the attitude today, which used to be the attitude not of the professor so much, but of the intellectual class. It is an attitude which is rationalistic, which is in favor of planning as against individual freedom, let us say, in favor of centralized government as distinct from decentralized government. It is utopian, I think, in the sense that Sam Hayakawa used that word, because they believe that a better world can be made out of the present world and that they know how to do it, because that's their specialty. So the word bias bothers me. Now, if you're simply saying that the academic community has a way of looking at the world which predisposes them to what we call liberalism, neoliberalism, whatever the term you wish, the answer is yes, of course. There's no doubt of that.
I would give you the thought, and I'd like to see what Sam thinks about it, that the changing meaning of the word liberal. Well, academics have always been liberals. A century ago, a liberal meant in practical government policy almost the opposite of what it means today. A century ago, liberal academics were saying reduce the influence of government. A century later, they're saying increase the influence of government. Same intellectuals doing it all the time and holding on to that word. But I think also, sir, I would make this one question to the gentleman attorney, put this one point, that you mustn't overlook the diversity in academic opinion. And we know we have a sociology of knowledge. It is kind of stable. And we know that, that a physicist will tend to be radical in his politics, and an engineer will tend to be conservative. And that reflects something very fundamental to the kinds of work they do. And it is interesting about government and politics itself. Why are your politics the way they are? Sam?
The engineers don't tell government how the world should be run, whereas intellectuals do. And engineers don't classify themselves as intellectuals, but as practical men. There's a real difference in psychology there.
Right. We agree on that.
And so the ultimate ends of society are determined by whom? Well, maybe the philosophy department or the English department, the social science department. But there are the other kinds of professors who do arrogate to themselves the privilege of answering the question, what is the world for? What is society for? To what end shall we direct society as a whole? And this is where we get into this utopianism. For one class to say we are the people who have the ultimate answers, that's the typical, shall I say, liberal arts, social science arrogance. And I've been fighting that as a professor for a long, long time. And that is our great, great weakness as professors of philosophy. And why is it, for example, that in the average English department at a large university, you have 59 Democrats, 1 Republican, and 40 Maoists?
Well, Professor Bork, yeah, Senator Hayakawa raised the point that I wanted to. Senator Moynihan is talking about the diversity in the academic world. That diversity does not exist in the departments that have to do with policy in the most prestigious universities. And in fact, I have had the conversation that followed from your point, Senator Hayakawa, when I once said that I was dubious about a Maoist, and the answer I was given was, but we have to have a Maoist to balance the Stalinist we already have. There is, in the policy sciences and in the professions, in the law schools, for example, you do find 40 Democrats and 2 Republicans. Now, that's a rough proxy for something else, I understand, but still it reflects something, and recruitment is heavily skewed. Now, I think that has implications both for domestic policy in the sense that the academic world and the policy sciences and in the law schools is heavily in the favor of increasing governmental intervention in the society and in its processes, usually in favor of greater equality and redistribution of wealth, which I think has long-run implications that are not too favorable for the preservation of capitalism and for the preservation of a free society. We haven't mentioned the other aspect, which is the influence of intellectuals or the academic world upon foreign affairs and foreign policy. And I would throw out remind you that George Orwell wrote about this subject. He said, towards the end of World War II, when it was quite plain that the Nazis were going to lose and that England was going to win, the intellectual classes remained more defeatist in England than any other class, and talked about negotiating peace or finding some resolution with Germany rather than carry the war to a continuation. Orwell suggested, and much of our experience may suggest, that academics and intellectuals, as a class at least, have less staying power in world contests and less, perhaps, faith in the fact that this kind of a society is ultimately a better kind of society than those nations we're in a contest with. If that is true, then that has long-run serious implications.
But
for our
Orwell
ability
also said, did he not, that this is because they have more imagination.
Well, whether or not it's because they have more imagination.
Which is what they're good at. That's their trade, having imagination. They can imagine defeat where people with less imagination couldn't, thank God.
No, I think he was saying that they could imagine the pains one would have to go through to arrive at victory, and therefore were less willing to put up with it. But what I was trying to say is that if that is their characteristic for whatever reason, and if they are a terribly influential class, then that has implications for our ability to conduct, over a period of decades, a rivalry and a contest with the Soviet Union.
All right, I think this concludes another Public Policy Forum presented by the American Enterprise Institute for Public Policy Research. On behalf of AEI, our heartfelt thanks to the distinguished panelists and experts in the audience for their participation.
This Public Policy Forum on campus influences on our political system has brought you the views of 4 leading experts in the field. It was presented by AEI, the American Enterprise Institute. It is the aim of AEI to clarify the issues of the day by presenting many viewpoints, in the hope that by so doing, those who wish to learn about the decision-making process will benefit from such a free exchange of informed and enlightened opinion. I'm Peter Hackus in Washington.
This Public Policy Forum series is created and supplied to this station as a public service by the American Enterprise Institute, Washington, D.C. For a transcript of this program, send $3.75 to the American Enterprise Institute, 1150 17th Street Northwest, Washington, D.C. 20036.